Hello Orchid friends, how are you? Welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time watching my video, my channel is all about orchids. From what orchids I have, how I grow them, my thoughts on certain orchid topics, to what orchids in my collection are blooming, etc. So if you want to follow along my orchid hobby adventure, please consider subscribing to my channel and turn on the notification. Today's video is more or less a update video for me to share with you this orchid's subsequent blooms. And I think this orchid is a very interesting sequential bloomer from a supermarket. And let's start by looking at the last upload, the last video that I did on this orchid, and then we will go into its recent blooms. Purchased this orchid at my local grocery store, Trader Joe's, and I've had this orchid since I think springtime last year, so it's just about a year since I had this orchid. However, this orchid has already produced quite a few sequential blooms since I purchased it. And here we're going to talk about the story behind its second and third flowering. So this is the second flowering of this orchid, and I find it pretty charming because the color combination, you have the yellow background, but then you also have very intricate pattern and sequence on the flower, and also it has that pink and yellow combination, which I love, and the lip is also really thick and big. So if we go back in time to October 23rd, 2018, so that's when this orchid finished its blooming completely, and it was growing a new leaf, but I decided that I really wanted to unpot this orchid and give this orchid the semi-hydroponic setup, because I was guessing, just looking at the roots, I think it may like semi-hydro, and I was right. It was kind of a gamble, but you know, when it comes to a grocery store fowl, one thing that I can be sure is, even if I lose it completely, it's something less than $10 US, right? So I was being a little bit more brave and bold about this orchid, so I went ahead and repotted it with no hesitation. And as you can see here, I use a transparent cup, but then if you're new to my channel, you know, you probably don't know that I use an outer cup to block sunlight to reduce algae formation. But semi-hydro is a way to grow orchids where you'll have a reservoir. That's why you see two holes on the side, and because anything below that two-hole level, then it's where the water would sit, and then anything above is more airy. So the way that I planted this orchid or positioned this orchid is more upright, so that way, because this orchid I already saw some tendency of leaning forward, but later you're gonna see in this video that I failed in keeping this orchid in a more upright position, because this orchid already had that natural tendency to grow pendantly, and as the flower spike elongated, it just got even more top heavy. So in the end, you're gonna see that this orchid is looking like it's gonna fall out of the pot. But the good news is that it's not going to, because this orchid is doing so well that some of the roots are already grown into the reservoir at the bottom of the cup, and with the combination of leca and hydrocorn, it's actually pretty stable. So I think this orchid is well anchored within this container. So it was end of 2018 that I discovered that this orchid was continuing to grow its flower spike and producing buds. It was hiding behind two flowers, so I didn't actually see them until the end of 2018, and beginning of 2019 I also noticed that there were two spots on the existing spikes that are growing something. Well, it's a secondary spike, so I was very happy that it's happy and it's growing more sequential bloom or potential sequential blooms for us. So when this orchid first opens its flower, it usually has more red color to it, and as time goes on, it will gradually lose that red color and become more yellow. But the pattern and dots on the flower remains, but it's just the red that would somehow dissipate a little bit. And another thing that's not so perfect about this flower is that even though it's probably very close to species orchids, but it's not fragrant. It does not have any fragrance at all. Maybe that's why it ended up at a grocery store. I don't know. And so if you look at the total time for the last flower cycle, it was almost 3 months, which is quite incredible, because if you then also factor in that it's growing 2 more buds, and then it's also growing secondary spikes, and then elongating the other branch, you know, it could be that this orchid could be in flower for almost a whole entire year. Now, the bud blast photo that you saw, it was actually my mistake, because during the process of moving it or watering it, I know I at least hit that flower, that particular bud against the wall twice. So I think that might have, you know, caused enough distress, physical distress or emotional distress for that particular bud to blast. Oh well, that's bud blast is just part of orchid growing, right? So as an orchid hobbyist, you just have to accept it. It does happen, and when it happens, we are not happy about it, but it does happen. You know, sometimes it's the temperature, sometimes it's the humidity, sometimes it's just because this orchid is not healthy enough to sustain all its buds, and sometimes it's just because of pure bad luck or stupidity, right? Clumsiness of orchid growers, like what I did. But anyway, it's still a pretty good orchid, even though this particular sequential bloom cycle only gave me 1 flower, well, 2 buds, but only 1 flower in the end, but it's still pretty good. I mean, I know this orchid will probably be in bloom with this 1 flower for quite some time to come, and then as the other 2 flower spikes are developing, we can potentially have another interesting viewing of this orchid in the near future. For less than $10, I think this is such a great buy, but since I bought this orchid though, I haven't seen this orchid being available, being carried by Trader Joe's anymore, so I'm not sure what's going on. Anyway, what you're seeing here is a secondary spike that was developing, and around February 2019, that's when the buds were more visible. And then, you know, I think in probably, I'm guessing a month or so, this orchid, these 2 buds should be immature enough to bloom. And here is the other branch on the main flower spike that is elongating its tip. So it's also doing pretty good, and I also think that this one is slightly behind the secondary spike in terms of maturity. So I'm thinking that this one will probably come to fruition for us in probably 2 months or so. It could be faster depending on the temperature and the weather in my area. So remember at the beginning of the video, I was saying that I was trying very hard to keep this orchid upright, but then, you know, due to gravity and the growth of the flower spike, it is still now growing pendantly, facing almost downward. But the good thing is that the roots are pretty well anchored in the container. This is what it looked like when I first finished repotting this orchid. But back to the roots, it's pretty healthy, so there are a couple big roots that are already reaching the bottom of the container, so I know this orchid is pretty well anchored. So in other words, unless there's any big problem that I see with this orchid, I'm going to just keep it as is, because if it's not broken, I'm not going to fix it. Because every time you repot an orchid, you always have this potential risk of setting back an orchid. And just for an orchid to have a better position, but without bloom because of being set back, I don't think that's worth it. I don't know if you agree with me, but I think setting back an orchid is really the last thing that any orchid hobbyist would want to do. Now let's move forward to March 2019. One of the buds started to open, and what I find really interesting about this orchid is that the newer flowers are always more on the red side, and as time progresses, then it starts to lose that red tone, and the older flowers, as you can see here at the bottom right corner, would have slightly more yellow color than red. And this one is really just an interesting foul, and I totally get my money's worth, I think, because starting from fall last year, it started to put out blooms, and then it had more sequential blooms, and now the two other branches on the same flower spike also put out, new buds and a secondary spike. So I think I definitely got my money's worth. I think I only paid $8.99 for this mid-sized Phalaenopsis orchid. I don't have an ID for this one because unfortunately it just did not come with a tag, even though it says royal yellow. I haven't been able to find credible parentage information on what makes the hybrid royal yellow. So, at least it has a name, but I haven't really been able to find the parentage information. Another thing I want to mention about the color to orchid bloom is that sometimes we know flowers, the color of the flower will fade as it ages. But another factor could be the fertilizer, right? If you give the right fertilizer, the color saturation may be better. Something that my Chinese subscribers shared with me is that during the bloom cycle, when the orchids are in bloom, it's okay to use the balanced fertilizer, for example, the 20-20-20 for its NPK, and use quarter strength or 1/8 strength, 1/8 of a strength on a orchid that's in bloom, and that supposedly would help with the bloom to last longer. According to this subscriber, it's something that an orchid nursery shared with her. So I'm just gonna put it out there. I heard it from someone else who heard it from an orchid nursery, allegedly. So you can probably give it a try and see what happens. Just don't try it with a very expensive orchid, right? So take a grocery store Phalaenopsis orchid, a peasant phal, test it out for yourself. I do have a plan to test it out because I've already purchased the balanced fertilizer, but I have not started using it. So I think in a couple months when the weather is nicer, I'm gonna go to a grocery store, probably pick out the same type of Phalaenopsis orchid, probably like a 2 minis, right? Because they're cheaper and easy to find. I'll pick 2 of probably the same condition, same bloom count, same leaf numbers, and pretty much the same root system, just to give it a try and see if the one received the balanced fertilizer would actually last longer. This is all I have for you today. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you would like to get more orchid related videos from my channel, please subscribe and turn on the notification. I want to wish you happy growing, and I will talk to you in my next video. Ciao!